Detective Mark Reynolds had spent the last 15 years serving his city with honor. He had always believed in justice, in doing what was right, and in protecting the innocent. People trusted him. His fellow officers respected him. The community saw him as a hero. But in a single moment, everything changed. One evening, as he was getting ready to leave the station, his captain called him into the office. Mark walked in, expecting to discuss a routine case, but the look on the captain's face was serious. Too serious. Before Mark could ask what was wrong, two internal affairs officers entered the room. They told him he was under investigation for corruption and evidence tampering. At first, Mark thought there had been a mistake. He laughed it off, assuming they had the wrong person, but then they showed him the files. They had documents with his signature on them, proving that he had altered key evidence in a major drug case. They had security footage of him entering the evidence room at an unusual hour. They even had a witness, another officer, who claimed to have seen him do it. Mark's head spun. He knew he had never done such a thing. He had never taken shortcuts, never planted or removed evidence, but the proof against him was overwhelming. He protested, saying that someone must have set him up, but no one wanted to listen. His captain, the same man who had once praised him for his dedication, now looked at him with disappointment. He was asked to turn in his badge and gun immediately. Word spread quickly through the department. The same officers who had once called him a friend now avoided him. Some whispered about him behind his back. Others looked at him with anger, as if he had betrayed them. In just a few hours, his world had turned upside down. By the time he reached home, reporters were already outside his house. Cameras flashed as he stepped out of his car. He could hear their questions. "Did you do it, Detective Reynolds? How long have you been involved in corruption? Do you have anything to say to the public?" Mark ignored them and pushed through the crowd, desperate to get inside. His wife, Lisa, was waiting for him. She had seen the news. Her face was pale, her eyes filled with fear and confusion. She asked him if it was true. He told her it wasn't. He swore on everything he loved that he had been framed. But doubt was already creeping into her eyes. A few days later, Lisa packed her bags and took their 10-year-old daughter, Emily, to her parents' house. She told Mark that she needed time to think, that Emily needed to be away from all this chaos. Mark wanted to argue, wanted to beg her to stay, but he knew it wouldn't help. So he let them go, standing alone in the doorway as the woman he loved drove away with their daughter. For the first time in his life, Mark Reynolds, a man who had always fought for justice, felt completely powerless. Mark sat alone in his empty house, staring at the walls. Just a few days ago, this place had been filled with laughter. Emily's giggles as she played in the living room, Lisa's soft humming in the kitchen. Now it was silent. The emptiness felt heavy, pressing down on him like a weight he couldn't lift. Everywhere he turned, the world seemed to be against him. The news channels kept replaying his story, painting him as a corrupt cop who had betrayed the trust of his department and the people. Neighbors who had once greeted him with warm smiles now looked away when they saw him. Some even whispered behind his back. His phone barely rang anymore. The few friends he had in the force had either stopped talking to him or told him they couldn't be seen with him until things were cleared up. Mark tried to reach out to Lisa, but she wouldn't answer his calls. When he sent her messages, all he got in return was a simple reply. "Emily is safe." That was all she said. Nothing about when they would come back. Nothing about whether she still believed in him. His lawyer had already warned him that this case was bad. The evidence against him was strong. The department had found money deposited into a secret bank account under his name. Mark knew he had never opened that account, but on paper it looked like he had taken bribes. His fingerprints were also found on tampered evidence. It was impossible. He had never touched those files. But there was no way to prove it. With no job and no one to turn to, Mark decided to investigate on his own. He spent hours going through his past cases, looking for anything that could explain why someone would want to frame him. He had arrested plenty of criminals. Drug dealers, gang members, corrupt businessmen. Any one of them could be behind this. But how did they manage to plant so much evidence against him? How did they turn his own department against him? One evening, he sat in his car outside the police station, watching from a distance. He saw officers he had worked with for years walk in and out, laughing and chatting as if nothing had changed. He wondered which of them still believed in him. Did any of them? Or were they all convinced that he was guilty? Just as he was about to leave, he noticed someone standing across the street. It was Emily. She had snuck away from Lisa's parents' house to see him. His heart ached at the sight of her. He got out of the car, and she ran into his arms. "I know you didn't do it, Daddy," she whispered. Tears filled Mark's eyes. The whole world might have turned against him, but in that moment, he realized something important. He wasn't completely alone. His little girl still believed in him. And for her, he would fight until the truth came out. Mark held Emily tightly, feeling the warmth of her small arms around him. For the first time in days, he felt a sense of hope. No matter how many people turned against him, his daughter still believed in him. That meant everything. Emily looked up at him with wide, innocent eyes. "Mom doesn't want me to see you," she whispered. "She says it's too dangerous." Mark sighed, gently brushing her hair back. "I know, sweetheart," he said. "Your mom just wants to keep you safe." "But you didn't do anything wrong," Emily insisted. "Why won't people believe you?" Mark wished he had an answer. He wished he could explain why the world was so quick to judge, why even his closest friends had doubted him. But he didn't want to burden Emily with those thoughts. She was only 10. She shouldn't have to understand things like betrayal and corruption. Instead, he forced a smile and said, "Sometimes the truth takes time to come out, but I promise you, I will fix this." Emily nodded, as if she believed him without question. Then she reached into her pocket and pulled out a small folded piece of paper. "I made this for you," she said, handing it to him. Mark unfolded the paper and felt his throat tighten. It was a drawing. Emily had drawn a picture of the two of them holding hands, with the words "My hero" written above his head. Tears threatened to spill from his eyes, but he blinked them back. "This is the best gift I've ever gotten," he told her. "I'm going to keep it with me always." Emily smiled, but her joy was short-lived. She glanced over her shoulder, suddenly nervous. "I have to go before Mom finds out," she said. "I just wanted to see you." Mark hugged her one last time before watching her run off. He sat in his car, staring at the drawing in his hands. It gave him strength. If nothing else, he had to clear his name for Emily. She deserved to have a father she could be proud of. That night, he barely slept. He kept going over the case, trying to find a clue, anything that could prove he was being framed. Then he remembered something: the security footage. The department had shown him a short clip of him entering the evidence room. But what if there was more? What if someone had edited the video? The next morning, he reached out to an old friend, a retired officer named Frank who had once worked in security. Frank agreed to meet him at a diner outside the city, away from prying eyes. When Mark explained his theory, Frank nodded. "I know a guy who can check the footage," Frank said. "But it won't be easy. You sure you want to do this?" Mark's jaw tightened. "I don't have a choice," he said. If there was even the smallest chance to clear his name, he had to take it. He owed that to Emily. Mark's heart raced as he sat in the dimly lit diner, nervously stirring his coffee. Frank, his old friend from the force, sat across from him, a knowing look in his eyes. It had been years since they'd last talked like this. Years since Mark had needed someone he could trust. The case against him seemed hopeless. The evidence stacked against him was overwhelming, and every attempt to explain his side had been met with disbelief. The thought of spending the rest of his life behind bars was unbearable. Yet despite it all, a tiny flicker of hope remained. If he could find one shred of proof, one small crack in the case, he might have a chance to clear his name. "I've got a friend who can dig into the footage," Frank said, breaking the silence. But you have to understand, it's not gonna be easy. The department's not gonna hand it over willingly." Mark nodded, feeling the weight of the situation. He knew it was risky, but it was the only lead he had. "I'm willing to do whatever it takes," he replied, his voice steady despite the nervous tension swirling in his stomach. Frank looked at him for a long moment before he spoke again. "I'll make a call. You should lay low for a while. It could take a few days to get the footage. The last thing you need is someone noticing what we're doing." Mark agreed, knowing Frank was right. He couldn't afford to take any chances. His every move was being watched, his every action scrutinized. The idea of being caught in the act of trying to clear his name was terrifying, but it was the only option left. Over the next few days, Mark did his best to stay out of sight. He stayed at a small, inexpensive hotel on the outskirts of town, far from his home and the prying eyes of the media. The days felt endless, each one blending into the next as he paced the small room, trying to keep his mind off the looming trial. During this time, Emily sent him a few more drawings, simple pictures of the two of them, sometimes with hearts and smiley faces. Mark cherished every one. They were the only things that kept him grounded. He had to stay strong for her. Then, on the fourth day, Frank called him. "We got it," he said, his voice low. "The footage is clear. Whoever planted the evidence, they edited the video. The timestamp's off, and there's a part of the footage that's missing. It's all a setup, Mark." Mark felt a rush of relief flood through him. The evidence against him was fake, carefully manipulated to make him look guilty. "Where do we go from here?" he asked, his voice trembling with a mix of fear and excitement. "You take it to your lawyer," Frank said, "but you've got to be careful. This could get messy. There are powerful people involved in this, Mark. They won't let you walk away that easily." Mark swallowed hard, knowing Frank was right. The road ahead would be dangerous, but he had no choice. He couldn't let the people who had betrayed him win. For his daughter, for his reputation, he had to fight. He thanked Frank and hung up, feeling a sense of determination wash over him. The truth was finally within reach. All he had to do now was make sure it saw the light of day. Mark's hands trembled slightly as he gripped his phone. The truth was finally out there. Someone had edited the security footage to make him look guilty. But knowing the truth and proving it in court were two different things. He needed to be careful. The people who framed him wouldn't just sit back and let him expose them. Without wasting any time, he drove to meet his lawyer, James Carter. James was one of the few people who still believed in him. When Mark entered his office, James looked up from a pile of papers, his expression serious. "Tell me you've got something," James said, closing a file and leaning forward. Mark pulled out a flash drive and placed it on the desk. "Frank found the original footage," he said. "The timestamps were changed. A part of the video was erased. Someone inside the department did this." James picked up the flash drive and stared at it for a moment. "If this is real, it could change everything," he muttered. He plugged it into his computer, and they watched the footage together. As the video played, it became clear. Someone had doctored the evidence to make Mark look guilty. The real video showed Mark entering the evidence room at a completely different time than what the department had claimed. The missing footage suggested that someone else had tampered with the evidence, but that part had been conveniently erased. James sat back in his chair, exhaling sharply. "This is big," he said, "but it's not enough on its own. We need to know who did this." Mark's mind raced. He had spent years working with his fellow officers, trusting them with his life. The thought that someone he once called a friend had done this to him made his stomach turn. Then his phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen and froze. It was an unknown number. Hesitating for a moment, he answered. A familiar voice spoke. "Meet me at the old train yard. Alone." Mark's heart pounded. He recognized the voice. It belonged to one of his former colleagues, someone he had once trusted. Before he could ask any questions, the call ended. James frowned. This could be a trap. Mark nodded. I know, but I have to go. James sighed. Then at least let me inform the court about the video. We'll submit it as new evidence first thing in the morning. Mark agreed, then left, his mind racing. He drove to the train yard, his grip tight on the steering wheel. As he stepped out of his car, the cold night air sent a chill down his spine. The place was deserted, except for a lone figure standing near an abandoned train car. Mark walked closer, his pulse quickening. As he approached, he saw the fear in the man's eyes. I didn't know they would go this far, the man said, his voice shaking. I need to tell you something before it's too late. Mark took a cautious step forward, his eyes locked on the man standing before him. He recognized him, Officer Ryan Mitchell. They had worked together for years, patrolling the same streets, backing each other up in dangerous situations. Now, Ryan looked nervous, his hand shaking as he glanced around the empty train yard. I don't have much time, Ryan said in a low voice. They're watching me too. Mark's jaw tightened. Who's behind this? Ryan swallowed hard. It's bigger than you think. Someone high up in the department is running things, fixing cases, planting evidence, making sure certain criminals walk free while others take the fall. You got too close without realizing it. Mark's mind raced. He had handled many cases over the years, but he never imagined that corruption ran this deep. Why frame me? He asked, his voice edged with frustration. Ryan sighed. You were clean, Mark. Too clean. You didn't play along, didn't take bribes, didn't turn a blind eye like some others. They needed you out of the way before you started asking the wrong questions. Mark clenched his fists. He had always believed in justice, but now, that very system had turned against him. Who gave the order? Ryan hesitated, fear flashing in his eyes. I don't know for sure, but I have a name, Lieutenant Harris. He was the one who pushed for your arrest. He made sure the evidence against you was airtight. If anyone knows the truth, it's him. Mark felt a cold chill run down his spine. Lieutenant Harris had been his superior for years, a man he had trusted. It was hard to believe, but the pieces fit. Harris had been the one to call him into the captain's office that day. He had stood there, stone-faced, as Mark was stripped of his badge. I shouldn't be here, Ryan muttered, taking a step back. If they find out I talked to you, I'm finished. Mark grabbed his arm. Come with me. Testify. We can expose them together. Ryan shook his head. It's not that simple. They have eyes everywhere. If I testify, they'll come after me, maybe even my family. His voice trembled. I just wanted you to know the truth. You deserve that much. Mark felt frustration bubbling inside him, but he understood Ryan's fear. This wasn't just about clearing his name anymore. It was about uncovering something much bigger. Ryan pulled a folded piece of paper from his jacket and handed it to Mark. This is all I could get. It's a list of cases Harris and his people have tampered with. If you can prove this, maybe you can take them down. Before Mark could say anything else, Ryan turned and disappeared into the shadows. Mark unfolded the paper and scanned the names. It was worse than he imagined. This wasn't just about him anymore. He was about to take on something far more dangerous. Mark sat in his car, gripping the paper Ryan had given him. His hands felt cold, his mind racing with possibilities. The list of names was long, too long. If what Ryan said was true, then Lieutenant Harris had been covering up crimes and framing innocent people for years. This wasn't just about Mark anymore. If he exposed the truth, he could bring down an entire network of corruption. But that also meant the people involved wouldn't go down without a fight. Mark took a deep breath and drove back to his hotel. He locked the door behind him and spread the paper out on the small desk. He recognized some of the names, people who had been arrested under suspicious circumstances, cases that had never made sense. Some of them were officers like him. Others were civilians who had been caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. He picked up his phone and called James, his lawyer. When James answered, Mark got straight to the point. "I have proof. Real proof." James was silent for a moment, then said, "What kind of proof?" Mark glanced at the paper. "A list of cases that were tampered with. Corruption in the department goes deeper than we thought. Harris is at the center of it." James let out a long breath. "This changes everything, Mark. But we need to be careful. If Harris finds out you have this, you'll be in even more danger than before." Mark already knew that. He could feel the weight of it pressing down on him. "We need to get this to someone who can help," he said. "Someone outside the department. Maybe a federal investigator." James agreed. "I'll make some calls. But you should be ready for anything. These people won't just let you expose them." Mark hung up and sat in silence for a moment. He thought about Emily. He had promised her he would fix everything. And now, for the first time, he felt like he actually could. But he also knew this was the most dangerous part. If Harris or his people found out what he was planning, they wouldn't hesitate to stop him. Suddenly, there was a loud knock on the door. Mark's heart jumped. He wasn't expecting anyone. He moved quietly to the window and peeked outside. A black car was parked near the entrance, the same car he had noticed following him earlier that day. Whoever was outside wasn't friendly. Mark's instincts kicked in. He quickly grabbed the paper and stuffed it into his jacket pocket. He couldn't afford to lose it. Slowly, he moved toward the back door of the hotel room. He had to get out before they got in. As he reached for the handle, he heard the door being forced open. Mark didn't hesitate. As the front door burst open, he slipped out the back, his heart pounding. He stayed low, moving quickly through the shadows of the narrow alley behind the motel. The cold night air burned his lungs, but he kept going. He had no doubt who had come for him. Harris's men. They must have found out he had the list. He heard footsteps behind him, fast and determined. They were searching for him. He couldn't outrun them forever. He needed a plan. Spotting an old dumpster near the edge of the alley, he crouched behind it, pressing himself against the cold metal. He could hear two men talking. "He was here," one said. "He couldn't have gone far." "We need that list," the other replied. "Harris wants it back before morning." Mark clenched his fists. So, they knew. He had to be even more careful now. Slowly, he peeked around the edge of the dumpster. The men were scanning the area, their eyes sharp. He couldn't risk being seen. Then, an idea struck him. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. Quickly, he sent a message to James. "They found me. I have to move. Get ready." Then, he did something risky. He turned on his phone's flashlight and placed it on the ground, aimed at a different alleyway. It wasn't much, but in the dark, the sudden light would draw their attention. It worked. "There," one of the men shouted, rushing toward the light. The second man followed. Mark didn't wait. He moved in the opposite direction, staying low as he slipped through a side street. His car was parked 2 blocks away. If he could just get there. A black car suddenly turned onto the street ahead, blocking his path. Mark stopped in his tracks, his heart hammering. He had no choice but to run the other way. But before he could move, another figure appeared. "Ryan, what are you doing here?" Mark hissed. Ryan glanced around nervously. "I heard them talking. I had to warn you. They're not just after the list anymore, Mark. They want you gone." Mark gritted his teeth. He had expected this, but hearing it confirmed made his blood run cold. "Then we need to move. Now." Ryan nodded and motioned for Mark to follow him. They hurried through a side street, staying in the shadows. After a few minutes, they reached an old warehouse. Ryan pushed open a rusted door and led Mark inside. Mark took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. "I need to get this list to James before it's too late." Ryan nodded. "I know, but Harris won't stop hunting you." Mark met his eyes. "Then it's time to stop running. It's time to fight back." Ryan hesitated, then nodded. "I'm with you." Mark gripped the list in his pocket. The truth was within reach. Now he just had to survive long enough to reveal it. Mark sat on an old wooden crate inside the warehouse, catching his breath. His pulse was still racing from the chase. Ryan paced back and forth, his face tense. "We don't have much time," Ryan said. "Harris's men won't stop until they find you." Mark nodded. "We need to get this list to James before they do." He reached into his pocket, gripping the folded paper tightly. It was his only chance to clear his name and expose the truth. Ryan glanced toward the door. "I parked my car a few blocks away. We can use it to get out of here, but we have to be careful." Mark stood up, determination in his eyes. "Let's go." They slipped out of the warehouse and into the dark streets, moving quickly but cautiously. Every passing car, every shadow felt like a threat. Mark's instincts told him they were being watched. As they turned a corner, headlights suddenly flooded the street. A black car screeched to a stop in front of them. Before Mark could react, another car appeared behind them, blocking their escape. "We're trapped," Ryan muttered. The doors of the first car swung open, and a tall figure stepped out. Mark's stomach tightened. It was Lieutenant Harris. Harris walked toward them, his expression cold and unreadable. "I warned you, Mark," he said. "You should have stayed down." Mark clenched his fists. "I'm not going to let you get away with this." Harris smirked. "And what are you going to do?" "You have no proof." Mark pulled out the list. "This says otherwise." Harris's eyes darkened. "Hand it over." Mark shook his head. "Not a chance." Harris sighed and signaled to his men. They stepped forward, ready to take it by force. Just then, the sound of screeching tires echoed through the street. Another car appeared, speeding toward them. Mark recognized it instantly. James. The car skidded to a stop, and James jumped out. "It's over, Harris," he called out. "This whole thing is going public." Harris' expression finally changed. For the first time, Mark saw real fear in his eyes. "You don't know what you're doing," Harris growled. "Oh, I do," James said, holding up his phone. "I've already sent the evidence to the press and the district attorney's office. They're expecting you." Harris's men hesitated, exchanging nervous glances. The situation had turned against them. Harris's jaw tightened, and for a moment, Mark thought he might still try to fight. But then, the distant sound of sirens filled the air. Mark stepped forward, looking Harris in the eye. "It's over." Harris glared at him, but said nothing. Then, with a defeated sigh, he raised his hands as the first police cars arrived. Mark exhaled, feeling a weight lift off his shoulders. The fight was finally coming to an end. The flashing red and blue lights reflected off the buildings as the police cars surrounded the street. Officers stepped out, their hands on their belts, ready for action. Mark stood firm, watching as Harris and his men slowly raised their hands in surrender. Captain Reynolds, one of the few honest officers left in the department, stepped forward. His sharp eyes landed on Harris. "Lieutenant Harris, you're under arrest for corruption, evidence tampering, and obstruction of justice." Harris's face twisted with anger, but he said nothing as the officers moved in and placed handcuffs on him. His men were also taken into custody, their expressions filled with defeat. Mark let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. It was over. James walked up to him, a small smile on his face. "We did it, Mark." Mark nodded. "Yeah, but it wasn't just me. If it weren't for you and Ryan, this wouldn't have been possible." Ryan, standing a few steps away, let out a tired laugh. "I never thought I'd be on this side of things, but I couldn't let them get away with it." Captain Reynolds turned to Mark. "The department owes you an apology. You never should have been accused in the first place." Mark appreciated the words, but he knew an apology wouldn't erase everything he had been through. His career, his reputation, everything had been torn apart. But at least now, the truth was out. As the officers finished loading Harris and his men into the patrol cars, Mark felt a familiar presence behind him. He turned and saw Emily standing near the sidewalk, her eyes filled with emotion. "Dad," she called, running toward him. Mark caught her in his arms, holding her tightly. He closed his eyes, feeling the warmth of her embrace. This was what mattered most. "I knew you'd prove your innocence," Emily whispered. "I never doubted you." Mark pulled back slightly to look into her eyes. "I promised you I'd fix this. And I meant it." Tears welled up in Emily's eyes, but she smiled. "I'm just glad you're safe." James walked up beside them. "It's going to take time, but now that the truth is out, you can rebuild your life." Mark nodded. He had lost his job, his reputation had been damaged, and the past few weeks had been a nightmare. But he had something that couldn't be taken away: his integrity, his daughter's love, and the truth. Captain Reynolds placed a hand on Mark's shoulder. "The department needs people like you. If you're willing, I'd like to help you get your badge back." Mark was silent for a moment. Then he nodded. "I'd like that." As he stood there with his daughter in his arms, watching the corrupt officers being taken away, he knew that this was the beginning of a new chapter. Justice had won. And for the first time in a long time, Mark felt free.